A pale Kansas sun hung above the dusty auction yard, and a dry spring wind pushed wheat chaff across rows of worn farm equipment waiting for new owners. Among the crowd stood Ethan Miller, a 23-year-old farmer with lean shoulders, sun-darkened skin, and thick brown hair that never seemed to stay combed. His jaw was sharp, the kind shaped by stubbornness rather than comfort, and faint stubble shadowed his face after too many nights spent working instead of sleeping. Ethan had the quiet manners of a man raised to listen more than speak, but there was a quiet steel in him, forged the year before when his father died suddenly in a tractor accident. Since that day, grief had hardened into determination. The small 80-acre farm and its debts now rested entirely on his young shoulders. At the far edge of the lot sat the machine no one wanted, a 1960 grain combine that looked less like equipment and more like a skeleton of rusted metal. Its faded green paint had peeled into brown scars, both front tires sagged flat into the dirt, and brittle belts dangled like loose bones. When the auctioneer mentioned it, a few men laughed before the bidding even began. Standing near the front was Harold Bennett, a well-known farm equipment dealer in the county. Harold was a broad man in his late 40s with slick gray hair, a thick mustache trimmed with pride, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to selling new machines to prosperous farmers. His pressed shirt smelled faintly of cologne and fresh rubber tires from his dealership lot. Years of success had made his voice smooth but sharp, and when he laughed, people tended to laugh with him. When Ethan quietly raised his hand and bid $90, the laughter spread through the yard like wind through dry grass. Harold turned, studying the young farmer with amused disbelief. "Son," he said loudly enough for half the crowd to hear, $90 could start a down payment on a real combine. That heap, there's just scrap metal." More chuckles followed. Ethan felt them like small stones hitting his back, yet he didn't turn around. Inside, his thoughts drifted to his father's old workshop, to oil-stained tools and patient lessons given under dim barn lights. "Machines," his father used to say, "only look dead until someone cared enough to understand them." Ethan signed the purchase slip without another word. Behind him, the crowd kept laughing. But Ethan only looked at the silent machine waiting in the dust. To everyone else, it was junk. To him, it was the only chance he had. The combine arrived at Ethan's farm just before sunset, its metal frame groaning on the borrowed trailer as if the machine itself resented being dragged back into the world. Dust rose behind the tires, while the prairie wind carried the distant smell of wheat fields preparing for summer. Getting the machine off the trailer became the first battle. The wheels refused to turn, locked stiff after nearly 2 decades of sitting. Ethan eventually tied a chain from the frame to his aging pickup truck and pulled slowly while the rusted rims scraped across the dirt. The sound was ugly, like bone against stone, but finally the combine slid into the shadow of his wooden barn. Watching from the fence line was Tom Bradley, Ethan's nearest neighbor. Tom was a tall, narrow-shouldered man in his mid-50s with weathered cheeks and a gray beard that grew thick along his jaw. Years of drought and failing harvests had carved patience into his face. And though he spoke little, people trusted him because he rarely judged anyone too quickly. Tom spat a bit of tobacco into the dust and shook his head slowly. "Son," he said gently, "that machine hasn't moved since Eisenhower was president." Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead, but didn't argue. Deep down, he already knew Tom might be right. The next morning, he began taking the combine apart. Rust greeted him everywhere. The threshing drum was frozen solid, the grain conveyor packed with brittle mouse nests, and the long belts that once carried grain through the machine cracked apart in his hands like dry bark. The engine was worse. When Ethan removed the inspection plate, thick black sludge oozed from the crank housing like tar that had forgotten it used to be oil. For a long time, he simply stared at it. $90 suddenly felt like a heavy weight in his chest. He imagined the laughter from the auction yard echoing again, especially Harold Bennett's booming voice telling him he'd bought scrap. But Ethan remembered something else too. His father's workshop. The quiet evenings when the old man would sit beside a disassembled engine and say, "Every machine is just a puzzle. Start with one piece and the rest will follow." So Ethan started with the engine. Days turned into a strange rhythm. Each morning, Ethan worked for a local farmer repairing fences and hauling hay for small pay. Each night, he returned to the barn and studied the combine under a dim yellow bulb. Old repair manuals from the county library lay open on a wooden crate beside him, their pages smudged with grease and fingerprints. Sometimes a small companion kept him company. A scruffy farm dog named Riley slept near the barn door most nights. Riley was a 6-year-old mixed shepherd with dusty tan fur, one torn ear, and patient brown eyes that seemed to understand more than most people. The dog had wandered onto the farm months earlier and simply never left. While Ethan worked, Riley watched quietly, occasionally lifting his head when a wrench clanged against steel. Weeks passed. Bolts snapped, gears refused to move, and more than once Ethan nearly gave up. But slowly the combine began to surrender its secrets. Then one evening, while cleaning the engine casing, Ethan noticed something strange. The main engine compartment, unlike the rest of the machine, was unusually clean beneath the rust. Someone had coated parts of the inner housing with a thick sealant that had hardened like wax. Even the transmission housing had been carefully packed with grease to keep moisture out. Ethan ran his fingers along the metal edge, frowning. Whoever stored this machine hadn't abandoned it carelessly. They had protected the heart of it, and the rest of the combine might have been left to decay, but the engine had been preserved like something meant to survive time itself. Ethan leaned back on the barn floor, Riley resting beside him, and stared into the dark engine compartment. For the first time since the auction, a quiet question began growing in his mind. Why would anyone protect the inside of a dead machine so carefully? The first real sound of the engine came on a windy morning in late May, nearly 4 years after the combine had first arrived at Ethan's barn as a silent pile of rust. The Kansas sky stretched pale and endless above the fields, and the wind carried the scent of young wheat bending across the prairie. Ethan stood beside the combine with grease-darkened hands and a nervous tightness in his chest. He had rebuilt the engine piece by piece. New piston rings, cleaned valves, bearings polished by hours of careful grinding. Every bolt had been tightened twice, every hose checked. Yet none of that guaranteed the engine would actually live again. Machines had a strange way of resisting hope. Riley, the old shepherd mix, sat beside the barn door watching him. The dog had grown gray around the muzzle since the day Ethan first dragged the combine home, but his patient brown eyes still followed every movement as if he understood the importance of this moment. Ethan climbed into the cracked metal seat. The steering wheel felt cold under his palms. For a long second he hesitated, remembering the laughter from the auction yard years earlier. Then he turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then again. A sharp metallic rattle shook through the frame, and suddenly the old combine roared to life, its exhaust bursting into the open air like a long-buried voice finally shouting again. Ethan sat frozen, listening to the uneven rhythm slowly smooth into a steady growl. Heat filled his chest, and before he realized it, tears had begun sliding down his dusty face. The machine worked. By the fall harvest that same year, the combine was cutting through Ethan's wheat fields like a stubborn survivor that refused to die. The work was slow at first. Belts snapped, bearings overheated, and more than once, Ethan spent entire nights repairing the machine before sunrise. But each season, it grew stronger, and so did Ethan's confidence. Years passed quietly. While other farmers in Dawson County purchased newer, larger machines with bank loans hanging over their heads, Ethan kept running the same combine. He repaired every worn part himself, sometimes machining replacements in his barn using tools inherited from his father. Word began to spread. Farmers started bringing their broken equipment to Ethan's barn, hoping the quiet young mechanic could do what dealership mechanics could not. One of the first men to arrive was Mark Dalton, a broad-shouldered rancher in his early 40s with thick black hair streaked by gray along his temples. Mark had a square jaw covered in rough stubble and hands scarred by years of working cattle fences. A drought 5 years earlier had nearly bankrupted him, leaving him cautious and practical about every dollar he spent. When his tractor engine failed during harvest, the dealership mechanics told him the repair would cost more than the tractor itself. Mark had heard about Ethan's combine story and decided to take the chance. 2 days later, Ethan had the engine running again. That repair changed everything. Soon the barn became a quiet gathering place for farmers desperate to save their machines instead of replacing them. Ethan rarely spoke much while working, but people noticed his patience. He studied every mechanical problem like a puzzle rather than a nuisance, just as his father once had. Then the farm crisis of the early 1980s struck the region like a slow-moving storm. Crop prices fell, loan payments climbed, and farms that had been in families for generations began disappearing under bank foreclosures. One late autumn evening, as Ethan wiped grease from his hands in the barn, a familiar truck rolled slowly up the gravel road. Stepping out of the driver's seat was Harold Bennett. The dealer looked older than Ethan remembered. His once slick hair had thinned and turned nearly white, and the proud confidence in his posture had softened into something closer to exhaustion. The lines around his eyes suggested years of worry rather than success. Harold removed his hat and stood awkwardly in the barn doorway. "Ethan," he said quietly, his voice missing the sharp edge it once carried, "I hear you're the only man around here who can bring dead engines back." Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the combine resting in the corner of the barn, the same machine Harold had laughed at years ago. And slowly he realized the old machine had done far more than harvest wheat. It had built a future no one else believed was possible. Autumn arrived quietly in 1986, laying a cool gray sky over Ethan's fields while dry corn leaves whispered against each other in the wind. By then, Ethan was 38 years old, leaner than he had been in his youth, but stronger in the quiet way that long years of physical work shape a man. His dark brown hair had begun to show faint threads of gray near the temples, and the sharp angles of his jaw were now framed by a short, rough beard he kept trimmed more out of habit than style. Life had carved patience into his character. Hard seasons, long nights repairing engines, and the responsibility of keeping the family farm alive had taught him to move slowly, think carefully, and trust his hands more than luck. That October morning, Ethan stood beside the same old combine that had followed him through more than a decade of harvests. The machine had aged with him. Scratches lined its faded metal body, and several parts had been replaced so many times they barely resembled the original design. Yet it still ran faithfully every fall. Until the crack appeared. Ethan had spotted it while cleaning the transmission housing after harvest, a thin fracture creeping along the metal seam near the drive assembly. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but he knew machines well enough to recognize the warning. If the crack spread, the entire drivetrain could fail. So he began dismantling the combine deeper than he ever had before. Bolts came loose one by one, panels lifted away. The familiar scent of oil, dust, and metal filled the barn air. Riley, now an old dog with stiff legs and a whitening muzzle, lay nearby watching quietly as Ethan worked. Hours passed, then days. Late one evening, while scraping hardened grease from the inner engine frame, Ethan noticed something strange. The inner wall of the engine compartment didn't match the external measurements he knew so well. There seemed to be an extra layer of steel plate welded behind the main casing. Ethan frowned. He tapped the metal with the handle of a wrench. The sound was hollow. That shouldn't have been possible. Curious now, he carefully ground through a thin seam along the inner plate. Sparks flickered briefly in the dim barn light. When the section finally loosened and dropped away, a narrow compartment revealed itself, hidden between two layers of metal where no mechanic would normally look. Inside lay a weathered leather pouch wrapped in thick oilcloth. Ethan's hands froze for a moment before he reached inside. The pouch felt heavy. He opened it slowly on the wooden workbench. Stacks of old paper bills appeared first, the currency yellowed with age but carefully folded. Ethan counted twice before believing the number. $2,800. Beneath the money sat a brittle document sealed inside a plastic sleeve, a land deed granting ownership of 30 acres of farmland located in neighboring Ellis County. And under that rested a single folded letter. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky with age. The letter began with a name, Samuel Turner. Ethan had never heard of him, but the letter explained everything. Samuel Turner had once owned the combine decades earlier. In 1953, according to the letter, he had stumbled upon a damaged delivery truck abandoned along a rural road. Inside were several bags of money from a robbery involving an armored payroll transport. The thieves had fled after an accident, leaving part of the stolen cash behind. Samuel had taken a portion of it. At first, he planned to spend it on medical treatment for his wife, who had been slowly dying from a lung disease, but guilt had followed him like a shadow. Instead, he secretly used part of the money to purchase land and allow a struggling farming family to remain on it without rent. The remaining cash, $2,800, he could never bring himself to use, so he hid it. Not in a bank, not in a safe, he hid it in the one place no thief would search, inside his combine. The final lines of the letter explain that Samuel had sealed the engine compartment himself to protect the hiding place from rust and moisture. He had hoped one day to return and decide what to do with the money, but illness took him first. The machine had been sold after his death, the secret forgotten. For more than 30 years, the hidden compartment had waited silently through auctions, storms, and harvest seasons, until Ethan opened it. Ethan sat alone in the quiet barn, the letter resting in his calloused hands while the old combine stood behind him like a silent witness to a story no one had known. Winter drifted slowly across the Kansas plains, the year Ethan found the hidden compartment, covering the fields with pale frost and leaving the barn quiet except for the low creak of old wood in the wind. For several nights, Ethan barely slept. The leather pouch sat on the kitchen table beside Samuel Turner's letter, the faded ink carrying a confession that had traveled through more than 3 decades before reaching him. Ethan read it again and again under the yellow light above the table. The money was real. The land deed was legal. Yet the weight of the decision pressed heavily on him because he knew the story behind it now. Samuel Turner had never intended that money to become comfort for himself. It had been meant as a way to make peace with his conscience. Ethan decided he would treat it the same way. The first person he quietly helped was Mary Collins, a widow in her early 50s who lived on the far edge of Dawson County. Mary was a tall, narrow-shouldered woman with silver blonde hair usually tied in a loose braid down her back. Years of working alone on her small farm had given her sun-browned skin and strong hands despite her gentle voice. Her husband had died from a sudden heart attack 3 years earlier, leaving her with 2 teenage sons and a farm loan she struggled to repay. Mary rarely complained, but exhaustion had slowly settled into the lines around her eyes. Ethan paid off the overdue repair bill on her tractor without telling her who had done it. When Mary asked around town trying to discover who had helped her, no one knew the answer. Over the following months, Ethan used portions of the hidden money the same way, quietly, carefully, helping farmers who were closest to losing everything during the harsh years of the farm crisis. He never spoke about it. The secret remained between him, the old combine, and the memory of Samuel Turner. The land deed required more complicated work. After nearly a year of legal paperwork, Ethan finally gained ownership of the 30 acres described in the document. The land lay about 40 miles west, good soil that had been leased by different farmers over the years without anyone realizing the original ownership had never been updated. Instead of keeping it all, Ethan sold half the land for a very small price to Lucas Harper, a 24-year-old farmer just beginning his life in agriculture. Lucas was tall and raw-boned with sandy blonde hair and a scattering of freckles across his nose. His hands were already rough from farm work, and his bright blue eyes carried the restless determination of someone who had grown up watching older farmers struggle but still believed the land was worth fighting for. Ethan saw too much of his younger self in the young man to turn him away. Years passed again, quietly. By 1990, Ethan had reached his early 40s, and the old combine had served him faithfully for nearly 2 decades. The machine had been repaired countless times, yet the metal frame still carried the scars of its long life. Ethan knew its working days were nearly finished, so he made one final decision. He brought the combine back to the very same county auction where he had bought it for $90 years earlier. The story of the machine had spread far beyond the town by then. Farmers came to see it, collectors arrived with trailers, and even curious reporters stood near the edge of the crowd. When the bidding began, the numbers climbed faster than Ethan expected. 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. The combine finally sold for over $12,000 to a collector who promised to restore it and display it at agricultural shows. As the trailer carrying the machine rolled slowly away, Ethan stood quietly beside the auction fence. A familiar figure approached him. Harold Bennett looked older now, his shoulders slightly bent with age and his once thick mustache almost entirely white. The confidence that had once filled his voice had softened into something humbler. He extended his hand. "I laughed at that machine once," Harold admitted quietly. Ethan shook his hand with a small smile. Harold looked toward the road where the combine had disappeared. "Guess it turned out to be worth a lot more than scrap metal." Ethan watched the dust settle behind the departing trailer. "Yes," he said gently, "but not because of the money. Sometimes the greatest miracles in life do not arrive as shining opportunities. Sometimes they come disguised as rust, failure, or the kind of chance that makes people laugh. Ethan never set out looking for treasure. He only held on to something the world had already given up on. Yet through patience, quiet faith, and years of steady work, that forgotten machine became more than metal. It became a path that led him to help others, to rebuild lives, and to discover a story left behind by another man who once wrestled with his own conscience. Perhaps that is how grace often works in our lives. Not through sudden lightning, but through small choices made day after day. Through kindness we extend when no one is watching. Through the stubborn hope we carry even when others doubt us. Maybe somewhere in the ordinary moments of your own life, something just as unexpected is waiting, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Tell us in the comments what moment in your life once looked like a failure, but later became a blessing. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about faith, perseverance, and the quiet miracles that happen between people and the animals and land around them, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Wherever you are watching from, may peace find your home tonight, and may God watch over you and the ones you love.